as the President Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, His Excellency Muhammadu Buhari, GCFR, proceeds to inspect the officers and guards on parade, it will be necessary at this juncture to take a cursory look at the resume of this distinctive, incorruptible, and highly revered #1 citizen of our great nation, Nigeria.
He rode into power on the back of an unprecedented populist mandate. 1 year later, what has he done with it?
You hit the ground running when you land on solid ground, terra firma. But when you land, and you land in mud, what do? You can't run. You can't run. The first thing is to extricate yourself from that mud and then find firm ground before you begin to run. That was exactly what this administration made. There was a lot of rot. There was absolutely nothing to plan with. Nothing.
I'm Charles Aniagolu in Abuja. 12 months after he took office, President Buhari's critics have been excoriating in their criticism. They say the air in Nigeria is suppurated with dread, the atmosphere as combustible as ever, and he's been as slow as earthworms in taking any action and fulfilling his campaign promises.
We have a 6 trillion naira budget. Nigeria's is a 100 trillion naira economy. The business of government is, by its own budget of 6 trillion, is to trigger and attract the rest of the 94 trillion naira into this economy. By holding on or holding back for as long as the government did, by providing no direction or comfort for those who play with the balanced 94 trillion to make a move, I think the government has shortchanged the country and the people.
They don't have a plan, they don't have a roadmap. That roadmap that would have translated the promise of change into a program of actions. That didn't happen. I believe it didn't happen. And that's why people are still saying, well, where is the change you promised?
What has happened, according to critics, is the merciless targeting of those political opponents Mr. Buhari believes to be corrupt and putting them in the pillory, most notably those from the opposition People's Democratic Party, the PDP.
More than 50% of the people populating the leadership of APC just crossed over to APC within the last 1-2 years. Some of them were governors, ministers, held very high strategic positions in this country, in PDP. And all of a sudden, they become corrupt-free.
President Buhari's supporters, though, are endlessly optimistic, unbowed by what they see as a torrent of invective.
In a country of 170 million, you cannot but have skeptics. There is a tiny minority, but it's a vocal minority. And when they make all the noise, you think that is how the whole country feels, but that is not true. The truth is that a larger part of this country is with the president.
They dismiss the criticism as infuriatingly distracting. What the president met when he took office was a devil's inferno of corruption and a midden of rotten practice under President Jonathan.
This thing had reached such a ridiculous level that money intended for the procurement of weapons to fight Boko Haram. No, people sat like on the dinner table and just shared it to themselves.
So, come Nigeria's darkest hour, cometh the man with the so-called magic panacea to restore faith in the country and the formula to bring the nation back into the fold.
Here is a former military leader, defined by moral rectitude, a sense of a deep, reflective spiritual mind, some firmness of character, and with a growing court of personality, with millions of people attracted to him. So he was a bigger-than-life person.
Well, 1 year later, after those historic elections, Mr. Buhari's remarkable victory and his memorable swearing-in ceremony, what has changed and what have we learned?
Well,
this government is trying, first of all, to do is to show that the leadership will not tolerate corruption, to present to the people of this country another kind of leadership, a leadership that is preoccupied with developing the country, and a leadership that is not preoccupied with lining the pockets of the members of this government.
So given all that, has President Buhari managed to sweep aside the entangled briars of this complicated, dysfunctional and fantastically corrupt country, to quote one Prime Minister?
I do hope that the commitment of the government to end or to fight corruption will be translated to concrete reality. So far, after 1 year, none of those who have been indicted has been successfully prosecuted. No case has been concluded. And that is worrisome for many Nigerians.
Well, the government disagrees and says it's secured more than 140 convictions in 6 months. Not the big fish, though, and Nigerians are perhaps wondering whether the joke is on them as they wake up to find themselves in a nightmare they've chosen, the same nightmare they've been living all along, only more frightening this time.
What we have seen in 12 months is that, first and foremost, there's been the first negative GDP growth in 16 years in this country. That is comparing Q1 2016 with Q1 2015. Big difference. 2, increased unemployment and underemployment. Big difference. 3, inflation at 4-year record high, 13.7%. 4, currency pressures have increased.
Or maybe this is quite simply an indefinable moment in Nigeria's history where the people have chanced upon a turning tide, but no one's quite sure whether it is about to ebb or flow.
The past 1 year has been, honestly, it will be daunting for anybody that has to take on the whole Nigeria business for the first year. But where I will fault them greatly is the fact that they were very, very slow. The government has no speed of any sort at all.
His failings in, economic policy, not addressing the issue of deregulation sooner, not getting the budget, sorted out sooner, and so on, and even his stance on the exchange rate, on forex.
For this 1 year, if I mark his report card, my brother, I will tell you, we are not impressed. But maybe let's see what happens in the next 1 year.
Security, yeah, I will give 65. Corruption, 50. Economy is still down below.
It's a directionless government. The situation of the country is alarming. Every single individual is crying. No money, no food, no job.
We know what he can do. We trust him. People trust him, seriously, I know. We trust him.
On a cool, dusty morning a year ago, 29th May 2015, braced by a late-blowing harmattan breeze from the Sahara, President Buhari mounted the stage at Eagle Square, Abuja. He looked what he was, a noble soldier of war with a grim, weathered face, a ramrod gait, and a lean physique that seemed to tell of battles fought and survived. A physique that could never quite forget the pitch and the march of a military commander. Here was their weapon, loaded and primed, ready to fight their battles against corruption, insecurity, infrastructure decay, and poverty.
So help me God.
the long-awaited change not coming soon enough for the millions who had followed him, not just in Nigeria, but internationally as well, as I discovered when I interviewed the Zimbabwean analyst Dorcas Guata on Arise News in London, where she'd heard Mr Buhari speaking at Chatham House. But he also spoke, Dorcas, as any would-be president would, of change.
Yes.
He talked about education, health, which is an area that's, particular to you, job creation, pensions, and so on. What was your impression?
Charles, he seemed to have a handle on those things. He didn't wait to be asked about these
Yeah, but you
issues.
asked him a question about health. What was his response, and how do you sort of assess his response?
As a health expert, he relied on his team in the front, and I think inside him he was thinking, oh my God, thank God there's a guy in front who can sort of back me up on the health. Still, he's not a health expert. Does he have a handle on the issues? I felt reassured. The main institutions that are subject for development in any country are education and health and the army and all that sort of stuff. He seemed to have a handle on that. But one point is very clear, Charles. What made him excellent today, if he is excellent, is not necessarily his excellence. It's Jonathan's failures. Jonathan has failed to deliver, and what oppositions do, and when they do them really well, is go into that niche and find a trail. And he's shining today because Jonathan has failed.
And so, for President Jonathan, the agony of a humiliating defeat. In spite of blitzing the airwaves with slick ads such as this one, and spending billions of naira trying to win over voters, for the first time in Nigeria's fractured democratic history, an incumbent government had been voted out of power. President Buhari and his APC party had achieved the politically impossible. How did it all go wrong for President Jonathan and his PDP party, a party that had been in power since the end of military rule in 1999, whose members boasted at one stage that they would rule Nigeria for the next 60 years.
That's what happens when you take the people for granted. The people were taken for granted. The party in power then had been there for 16 years, and it had even boasted that it was going to be there for a minimum of 60 years. That is a classic example of taking the people for granted. The people did not matter again to that party in power, and the people had to show them that they matter.
I do not think that Jonathan was prepared for presidency. I think it was out of his depth in that office. That is a simple truth. However much you like his person, his simplicity, his humility, all those credits we can give to him. But he was not somebody who said, this is the job I desperately, passionately want to do. I am ready to do it. He didn't get that. There was not that fire in the belly. And those who were political operators and manipulators sensed that and collected power right from under his feet.
The PDP had been in power since 1999, swept into office by that spirit of enthusiasm that came with the end of military rule. But then, after 16 straight years and 3 successive presidents from the same party in power, perhaps on that abstract level of national psychology, the country was simply yearning for something else, a different trajectory, a different set of ideas and vision. So quite possibly, Goodluck Jonathan came at the wrong time. On a more concrete level, analysts have pinned down the zoning arrangement of the PDP itself as one of the major reasons the party lost the election. A committee set up by the PDP ultimately conceded that the zoning arrangement affected the party's capacity to compete in the north. Add to this a campaign that was substantially chaotic, a national psychology that weighed heavily against incumbency, and the clamour for power to shift to the north, and you essentially have the recipe that became a political disaster for the PDP.
It was the northern elite, both traditional civil society, faith-based elite, that rallied around Buhari, the man of the moment, with the gravitas, with the reach under the soul of the people, and said, that's the man we want. And the rest of the country said, we are fairly tired, like I said. National psychology didn't favor Jonathan. He said, well, 16 years of this PDP experiment in power and democracy building and development strategies. Apparently, there are some highlights you can talk about, but substantially the storyline have been transfigured into directions that may not be very positive. So let's try something different. And then with an effective, campaign machinery, very robust propaganda machine, and then a whole lot of other factors we've been talking about since, it was easy for Buhari to win the presidency.
So the fall of a president who once enjoyed record approval ratings, but whose star had fallen faster than a game bird shot in mid-flight. That failure to react to the security threat of Boko Haram and the unfolding tragedy of the Chibok girls, even as the whole world embraced their cause, became the final catalyst of all the resentments and dissatisfactions Nigerians felt against President Jonathan in particular and the PDP in general. It all came together into a big crisis of public confidence for the party as the elections approached, causing Nigerians to lose faith in President Jonathan. Quite simply, good luck was bad luck.
At the time, we had a lot of security issues. And those security issues of the Boko Haram, and especially the Chibok girls issue. I mean, all these problems were orchestrated. And at the end of the day, our party, with some measure of infighting, also did not pay attention to certain problems that were manifesting, even in the insecurity. So we started experiencing a disconnect between the leadership of the party and the grassroots.
As the elections approached, the PDP seemed to be getting more nervous. Nearly 50 million Nigerians were poised to vote on February 14th when the Independent National Electoral Commission, or INEC, decided the election must be delayed till March the 28th, citing security concerns. For the government of President Goodluck Jonathan, the postponement was a welcome development. But for the main opposition party, led by former military ruler General Muhammadu Buhari, there was deep suspicion of the motive behind the postponement.
The PDP administration has now engineered a postponement using the threat that security will not be guaranteed across the length and breadth of Nigeria because of military engagement in some states in the northeast. It is important to note that although INEC acted within its constitutional powers, it is clear that it has been boxed into a situation where it has to bow to pressure.
Nevertheless, the opposition accepted the postponement and prepared a robust campaign strategy. Mr Buhari and his APC party painted themselves as the populist outsiders who would fix all of Nigeria's problems. Not surprisingly, the public turned to the former strongman, known for his anti-corruption policies in a former incarnation as military dictator. During his brief reign as head of state between 1983 and 1985, Mr Buhari tackled corruption head-on and brutally, but with clear results that turned Nigeria from a crime-ridden country to one of relative safety and discipline. With such a track record, no one doubted that he would follow through on his pledge to battle official theft. What was doubtful was how he would handle things like modernization and the economy, given what some saw as his rather old-school orientation. But at that early stage, few policies combined with bold promises seemed enough for Nigerian voters. Never mind the fact that it was the fourth time General Buhari had sought the presidency, and one would have thought he'd have a clear plan of action. Surveys and polls reported him leading among virtually every socio-economic group, with a particularly strong showing among the country's lowest and most numerous classes in the Hausa Fulani north and the Yoruba west of the country. It was Lagos, this inferno of heat and noise and the odd beauty spots, that made the difference in the elections, with its 20 million people seething inside a metropolis built to house 1/10 that number. Lagos cast its massive vote in favor of President Buhari. This is a city where independent politics brews and boils over regularly against many incumbent governments. And President Buhari's APC party was able to tap into the enormous disaffection raging against President Jonathan here.
When you have a minority president, the odds are already stacked against him. He needed to do more than a majoritarian president. If you have an Igbo man as a president of a country, he's counted upon nearly 30 million people scattered across the country. So he's counting possibly on about 7, 8, 9 million votes already in his kitty. Same with the Hausa Fulani stock, same with the Yoruba stock. But as an Ijaw minority president, he may have less than 1 million votes to really secure at the home front. Then he needed to patch a patchwork of consensus building, what they can call a rainbow kind of coalition that could put it over.
On March 28, 2015, millions of Nigerians went to the polls to choose a new leader. Both the ruling PDP and the opposition APC had fought hard for their votes, but the results were almost a foregone conclusion. Muhammadu Buhari swept the polls as Nigerians lined up behind the man they believed would restore their country's fortunes.
The campaign of the APC candidate to end corruption and impunity attracted votes.
And of course the APC candidate.
APC won. Yeah, because he also had remained a man of integrity in the midst of the mess. Nigerians have come to identify him as somebody who could redeem the dented image of the country and remove Nigeria from this miasma of, corruption. And that was how he won the election.
There were always in Nigerian elections some allegations of irregularities and fraud. But even as the governing party considered its options, party leaders knew they were not going to be able to pull that off, because this had been an absolutely thumping victory. So Mr Buhari's biggest rival, the incumbent president, Goodluck Jonathan, graciously conceded. It was a hugely significant moment in Nigeria's turbulent democratic history. Never before had a sitting president been defeated in an election. But perhaps more importantly, never before had an incumbent willingly conceded defeat.
That is where I think that those who respect him for his honesty will give him credit. Those who know him well say that he was not going to interfere with INEC, the Independent National Electoral Commission. And he would ask them to do the needful. And those who support him will say that's why the election went the way it did. I have no way of knowing if that's true, whether he could have manipulated it, or whether the people were absolutely desperately ready for change. That could be a factor. But to the extent that he didn't manipulate it, I think that's been to the good of Nigeria, to the good of democracy in Nigeria, and to his own credit.
The people were yearning for change, they were hungry and thirsty for it, and when they saw a credible alternative to the party in government, they all queued behind the alternative, and that was how it happened. You know that President Buhari had always been a big brand. Since he began to run in 2003, he had been the most formidable opposition figure in the country. 2015 just offered him a wider platform, and that did it.
And so the man who would bring terror to Nigeria's corrupt elite had won the election by a clear margin. What was less clear was what he would do with the economy. His blunt promise to sweep away corrupt officials and terrorists and reduce poverty won him the backing of millions of Nigerians tired of ineffective governments. But in a country with a one-crop oil economy, battered by falling crude prices and hampered by poor infrastructure and poverty, meeting the lofty expectations he raised during his campaign would be hard enough. And so, as he busied himself moving into the Aso Rock presidential villa, everyone at home and abroad was watching fascinated to see how he was going to act on those big promises. Meanwhile, as he packed up his boxes, cleared his in-tray, and left the presidential villa for the last time, President Jonathan must have known what most Nigerians had known all along. General Buhari was not a man to be trifled with, and there would most likely be a day of reckoning over the roaring whispers of corruption allegations that had trailed the outgoing People's Democratic Party for the past 16 years.
I think that you judge people's economic performance against the resources available. In the Jonathan years, Nigeria had its best and greatest cash flow from oil. So these were the cash flows. What are the things that you can say have been done? What infrastructure, right? What investments and all. So quite frankly, it was a squandered opportunity.
So Nigeria at last had a new president under a new party, but the same old problems. With the voters dispatching of President Jonathan and his PDP party, how much had really changed? Well, for one thing, the elections had enjoyed a global seal of approval, most notably from the West and the UN.
I'm here to recognize such a great democratic achievement and political stability, and also stability and peace in this country under the leadership of President Buhari. And I have congratulated on his election, but more importantly, the peaceful and credible elections which have been carried out in this country. And I hope that this example will be emulated by many countries around the world. And this message of hope could be spread far and wide around the world.
But even as he took office, President Buhari offered few policy details. There was a broad campaign plan for the poor, for security, and for the economy, and a pledge to tackle corruption from the top all the way down to its roots, as well as restore due process and the rule of law. Though vague in the detail of how these plans and pledges would be implemented, Nigerians were full of zeal. Real dramatic change was coming, and with it would come a better life for all.
I think the trust, again, in my view, this is the biggest credit to this president. There is absolutely no wavering in the minds of Nigerians at all that if he fails to manage public good well, it is not because of lack of intention. They trust him solid.
But not everyone bought the idea that trust alone should be the best starting point. Where others cheered, Eddie Iro, a seasoned journalist and former head of Nigerian National Radio, held his counsel.
I think the first thing that this government failed to communicate to the Nigerian people is that change is a slogan. It's not a program. It's a promise of a program. Now, having captured the public imagination with the change mantra, it was important to begin to translate change into a series of programs that people can identify with and say, wow, that's what change means. That hasn't happened.
And then there's the nettlesome question of how long it takes for the president to get around to taking decisions and implementing them.
Buhari has come in. He inherited a difficult situation. His problem has been procrastination, not knowing the difference between urgent and important issues. Urgent issues cannot be postponed. Important issues need attention.
But there are those who see Mr. Buhari's immediate impact from a more philosophical point of view. They argue that a profound, crucial change is taking place in the mindset of Nigerians, a sort of massive intrusion into the national psychology that can only bode well for the future of the country.
So what Buhari has done in the past 1 year is to bend the arc of Nigerian history in very significant directions. There's now an open emptying out of that spirit of carnivales, of simulacrum, if you talk in postmodern terms, of carnival, of celebration and enthusiasm of everything is Bishonism. He's dampened that spirit to say, let us really know who we are. Let us even find out whether for the past 16 or even more years we've been living a false life. As a developing country, we purport to say we are rich. We have human resources, natural resources. Have we been able to tap into and convert these resources over the years into meaningful, empowering wealth? If we haven't done so, then we're a poor country. And we begin to really live like poor people. When we now look at the poverty of our condition, collectively and individually, we can begin now to address the issues that have infested us, the issue that this poverty has infested us with. People are not getting the point. That's why I want to take the discourse at a level that when he made his ministerial appointment 5-6 months or thereabout, he was to reduce from me the undue importance attached to the office of a minister who within 1-2 weeks of a president sitting in appoints his ministers. His entire village and about 50 dancing troops from that village comes into Abuja there to begin. So he said 2 people alone coming to the villa for his swearing in. Let it be a ceremony shorn of its tradition, is Bishonism. Then before Buhari, a whole lot of 15-car convoys of, siren blaring big boys all over the place, they seem to have shrunk in size. The massive, private jets littered our airports seem to have been disappearing of late. That is the first trend. That is critical.
On a practical level, certainly where the facts appear to be in the government's favor, is on how President Buhari's dealt with the security problems in Nigeria's northeast. When he took office a year ago, Boko Haram were firmly entrenched in 14 local governments in the northeast, their flags hoisted and fluttering as they arrogantly declared vast swathes of territory part of a glorious new caliphate. Today, a year later, they've lost control of all 14 local governments and have been squeezed tightly into their last remaining stronghold of Sambisa Forest.
This Operation Crackdown was aimed at clearing Sambisa Forest, the haven of the Boko Haram terrorists. In that operation, we have been able to clear a lot of villages. Almost about 20 villages have been cleared in this particular operation thus far in the 22 days of this operation, Your Excellency. We have also rescued over 150 people in this particular operation since it started, among which the celebrated girl Amina Ali this day. The officers and men of the armed forces have actually been involved in this operation. The Army, the Air Force have continued to carry out the bombardment, cars evacuation, close air support to the advancing troops who have been doing a clearing operation, cordon and search, and also blocking forces of the old Sambisa forest.
There is no single territory under Boko Haram now There is no single city or state in this country that is under curfew. The roadblocks have been removed. So peace has, and people sleep with two eyes closed now.
The entire northeast is now much, much safer. Maiduguri is normal. Aircraft fly into the airport, and normalcy is returning to the entire region, largely as a result of the renewed focus and revitalization of the capacity of the military to deal with the insurgents. We believe that the war is won, but the challenge now is how to win the peace by ensuring that the societies that have gone through this trauma are properly managed and reintegrated back to make their contributions to the development of Nigeria.
In a bid to make the final decisive push against Boko Haram, Mr Buhari has been on numerous trips to the West, and some military assistance has been forthcoming. The UK, for instance, has been helping with military training. The French have some troops on the ground and have been offering intelligence along with the Americans. There are said to be plans afoot to sell US attack helicopters to Nigeria, and President Obama is said to be seeking congressional approval to make this possible. That's a sea change from a year ago, when the US would not have considered such a proposal, given what they said was the high level of corruption and human rights abuse within the Nigerian army. So President Buhari succeeded in reducing the existential threat facing the country when he came to power, and beefing up a national army that was disorganized and in retreat. But there's been no decisive defeat in the way that many had hoped for. Although much of Boko Haram's territorial base has been dramatically recaptured, the group are still able to carry out frontal onslaughts against Nigerian troops, whilst also employing the classic terrorist strategy of asymmetric attacks against the populace. So, as the British Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond correctly put it, Boko Haram's strength may have been sapped, but the war is clearly not over. Barrister Mike Ejiofor, who for many years worked as an intelligence officer with the Nigerian government, agrees with the British assessment.
The government came in on the mantra of change and promising Nigerians that within a given short time, the Boko Haram will be routed. And I didn't quite agree then, because terrorism is a global war. It's not restricted to Nigeria. And anybody giving timeline on when insurgency or terrorism can end is either misinformed or doesn't have the sufficient knowledge of the problems on ground.
What I think the president really meant was that as a fighting military force that could engage our military almost in conventional warfare, that they have been defeated from that point of view. In other words, all the territory has been recovered, and they have resorted to the classical terrorist strategy, which the whole world is confronted with, and which calls for a different approach completely. So, of course, anybody at any time who believes in any kind of extremist ideology could strap themselves up with improvised explosive devices and blow themselves up. So, you know, from that point of view, yes, there are probably people who still are willing to, or who still subscribe to the extremist ideology of Boko Haram, and who are still prepared to act, you know, in sporadic attacks and isolated attacks.
But even as Mr Buhari seems to have gained the upper hand in the fight against Boko Haram in the northeast, another resurgent military threat is looming. Nigeria, a country that depends on oil, is once again under attack in the volatile oil-producing Niger Delta. They call themselves the Niger Delta Avengers. They've gone on the rampage, destroying oil facilities, disrupting supply, and killing policemen. The group has warned that their campaign will be bloody and relentless. They've given ultimatums to the international oil companies in the Niger Delta to shut down their operations or face the terrible wrath of a bloody, violent agitation.
That's a very big and a major threat, not just to Nigeria, the international community. You know, our mainstay is the oil.
The attacks have led to a big drop in oil production levels. So what does this violence on the rise in Nigeria's troubled oil-rich Niger Delta mean for Africa's largest economy?
What they have struck are those assets, oil-producing assets, where the Nigerian government revenue is at its highest, i.e. the land and swamp assets, the offshore assets. So by striking and sabotaging those pipelines, we have found that the oil that gives us the highest revenue has been put out of action. The only oil that is left is what they call the deep water. The deep water assets are the ones where we have production sharing contracts, and the Nigerian government take on those assets are less than 20%. So you produce 1 million barrels way up in the deep sea, right? And you get only 20% of revenue. The ones that you get 60%, which is on onshore, land, swamp, are the ones that have been sabotaged.
President Buhari has issued stern orders to the military to fish out those responsible for this militant activity, and many troops have been deployed in the villages around the creeks of the Niger Delta, raising fears of a major confrontation between the soldiers and the militants.
The president is really disappointed about this development. For him, security is the #1 problem this country has. After security, then the economy and all other things follow. And his disappointment arises from the fact that he had looked at the amnesty program and agreements left behind by Jonathan Yaradua government. And he has given a clear mandate to a retired army general to go and look at it and see how the agreements would be looked at so that they will work for both parties. Now, to find that the oil installations are being sabotaged all over again, is really not something that is pleasing. As you said clearly, they have nearly halved this country's oil output. This government is not going to allow this to continue.
When the president made a statement that he has directed the military to go and crush them, I don't think that's the proper way to do it. This is political, and it needs some political solutions. That's my, you see, you cannot deny Mr. President his right of being a military man, but he is elected president under a democracy. So he needs to consult more than issuing orders and directives to go and crush.
Even as varying measures of success are being recorded in the fight against insecurity, President Buhari is pushing ahead with a massive crackdown on the other area that's at the heart of his reform agenda, corruption. His supporters say he's tackling graft with a determination never before seen in Nigeria, and he's managed to uncover a corruption conspiracy that trails through a bewildering labyrinth in the government of the former President Goodluck Jonathan.
There was a lot of rot. There was absolutely nothing to plan with. Nothing. When the president came and he said he met a virtually empty treasury, he told you exactly the truth. There was nothing to work with, nothing to plan with.
The biggest of many scandals so far from that era has erupted in the office of President Jonathan's former National Security Advisor, Sambo Dasuki, from where more than $2 billion meant for equipping the army to fight Boko Haram was allegedly stolen.
I think Jonathan's #1 problem, from my own observation, is that he was not in control of it. He was in government, but he wasn't in power. How else can you make $2.5 billion recover from the looted funds of Abacha and allow it to be relooted. Where on earth is the National Security Advisor the person to dispense, to disburse military spending? It doesn't happen. National Security Advisor is a strategic thinker. He's not an accountant.
Mr. Dasuki is currently being prosecuted but continues to deny the charges. He's gone to the ECOWAS Regional Court of Human Rights to protest against what he says has been the gross violation of his civil rights. It's not yet clear where the center of the maze might be and where it might all end, but there is a sense of shock at the staggering amounts of money said to have gone missing during the presidency of Goodluck Jonathan. Particularly irksome, according to the anti-corruption and human rights lawyer Femi Falana, is the alleged diversion of money meant for the purchase of weapons, which allowed a ragtag army of militants to overrun part of the country.
I defended, most of the boys, the soldiers who were charged again illegally before several court-martials. And I made the point. Now these guys are saying they want to fight, but they have no weapons to fight. They didn't join the military, the army, to commit suicide. But they couldn't understand what I was saying. That about 5 trillion had been voted at me a mark for the Ministry of Defense for about 5 years. And you cannot account for this money. Why are you putting these boys on trial? And I was simply told by the military officers who were members of the court-martial, that Mr. Buhari, you are going political. But it's so clear now that we got it wrong because there was no leadership that was responsible, that was accountable.
The opposition PDP party of President Jonathan, which is headquartered in this building in Abuja, says its reputation has been grievously wounded by the allegations. The party is smarting under the barrage of criticisms, insisting that the president's anti-corruption fight is politically motivated.
If we go on arresting people, and more people are committing crimes, or more people are corrupt, and the public feels that only one side, you're punishing one side, you're leaving the others. But I would like it to cut across the parties, across ethnic groups. I didn't say that people who are corrupt should go scot-free, but let's not give the impression that all animals are equal, but some are more equal.
Even as Nigerians score the president high on his anti-corruption fight, many believe he has done little to stimulate the economy.
Just over a year ago, Nigeria was projected to be among the top 5 fastest growing economies in the world. But in the latest IMF World Economic Outlook, Nigeria has fallen out of the top 15. What really is behind this dramatic turn? Because, of course, while oil accounts for 75% of Nigeria's foreign exchange earnings, it only constitutes 15% of GDP. So is it the fall of crude oil prices that's responsible for Nigeria's economic stagnation, or is it, as some suggest, the absence of sound economic policies and ideas?
It's a question I put to Frank Ibogun, publisher and editor of Business Day, one of Africa's top business newspapers.
There was no direction. And so people kept asking, we needed the economic direction of the president. What they were saying, in effect, was we wanted to know, is it a state-controlled economy we're going to run? Were we, as we have always done in the past, going to co-opt the private sector, given, as it were, that all revenues had collapsed catastrophically, and government couldn't even pay salaries. So it meant the only chance of progress was in bringing in private sector investment. And the goodwill was there. Buhari only needed to write the check. But somehow we wasted time, and people outside were wondering, what the hell is going on in Nigeria?
While a clutch of high-level international investors have pulled out of Nigeria since Mr. Buhari took over, many top employers, amongst them Nigeria's leading banks, have laid off thousands of staff. It's thought that in Abuja alone, more than 50,000 workers have been let go. As the months wore on, Nigerians such as Bismarck Rawani, a respected economist, became increasingly wary.
From a macroeconomic standpoint, the performance has not been great. Now, what went wrong? What went wrong was this. There was some procrastination in terms of, one, policy decisions, being decisive about policies. Two, there's been some actually pondering rather than decisiveness in terms of understanding the variables. Three, as you block the leakages, there should have been a corresponding and immediate commencement of spending. So the delay in spending and coinciding with the contraction of economic activity led to a sharp slowdown in economic activity, leading to what we have now, which is negative growth.
I'll say that the economy was badly battered. It was indeed vandalized. And so it takes time. It takes time to work on it and bring it back.
Well, the impression that people are getting is that there was no plan.
Impressions are not necessarily true all the time. For instance, they keep saying there is no economic team. But, you know, they are so used to that style in the past in which government will put some people together and say, this is the economic team. But not every government must use that template. Now, ask me, who are the members of the economic team? We know that the vice president has the economic team. There is a minister of finance. There is a minister of national planning, budget and national planning. There is a minister of trade and investment, trade, industry and investment. There is a central bank governor. There is a chief economic advisor to the president who works in the office of the vice president, and so on. I hear people say, where's the economic team?
Because nobody's hearing from them. All we see is President Buhari.
It's not necessary.
Subtle diplomacy across the world.
It's not necessarily about hearing. It's about the effect, and the effect will come.
The government may or may not be right, but the fact is it's difficult to ignore the state of the country. Outside the glittering spectacle of the capital, Abuja, a land of desperate poverty, hawkers peddling their pathetic wares at the roadside, sights that would fill anyone with gloom. For those same majority poor, though, the inspiring presence of President Buhari still means a lot 1 year later. Many still believe that against the odds, he can bring meaningful change. Short of a full-scale revolution, his coming was a sort of people's revenge, in which he was to be the proxy spokesman for their own difficult lives, destroying the corrupt elite, killing off the terrorist bad guys, rebuilding the economy to favor the poor, and establishing law and order.
The only thing that keeps Nigeria going, from my personal opinion, is the fact that it's possible for this country to be great. We all know it. We can all sense it. And it's that quiet, subliminal, shared love that actually keeps this country ticking over and over again, but not ticking over the precipice, so to speak.
Away from the great tenements of poverty that threaten to overwhelm Nigeria, the leafy Lagos suburbs of Ikoyi and Victoria Island, where the rich and the professionals live. Somewhere in the middle of all that is Miliki, a sort of upmarket, bohemian, exclusive private lounge where the Lagos cognoscenti come to escape the frenetic pace of the city. They see themselves as part of a sort of yuppie class, young professionals, entrepreneurs, and agents of change who regularly get together to lock horns and to find a way forward for their troubled country. What do they make of President Buhari's first year in office?
this government isn't going to come with a wand and then whip everything to work, you know. But if they get it right, then we're a step to where we should be. Okay, so did they get it right? Not exactly.
He hasn't shown enough ability to either make the decisions or empower people who can make those decisions.
Are there certain things that the president as a person could have done differently a lot, especially with the economy?
At the last election, I didn't support him because I said, yeah, I think, you know, it's his credentials as an anti-corruption, crusader, well established, and I know that he's going to try to stem corruption, and even just his persona will have an impact on sort of reducing the rampant nature of corruption in government. But what I identified then, which is I see playing out, is that he really he didn't bring anything else to the table.
One of the major problems that this administration has faced is an expectancy management issue, or expectation management issue. So you come in 2014, 2015, and you raise the bar so high. Tell everybody, all Nigerians that everything that is being done right now can be done 100% better. These guys are clueless, they are not handling the situation well, knowing fully well that things are really bad across the world. So when we're evaluating the last 1 year, we're not going to evaluate you just on what you have done, but the expectations that you created for the Nigerian people.
What you said you
would do. I mean, I was looking at something that Lai Mohammed said in
It's pretty clear that it's impossible for President Buhari, or indeed any other world leader, to meet all his people's expectations in 1 year, more so in a country as problematic as Nigeria. But has he met even a few of them? Because even a few would be enough for many people. Nigerians are endlessly optimistic, but it's fair to say that every leader this unremittingly complex country has had since independence has, to a greater or lesser extent, let the people down. With President Buhari, the events of the past year have for many Nigerians happened at bewilderingly slow speed. But to be fair, Mr. Buhari inherited lots of unanticipated imponderables, which have made it hard to predict which way the pendulum might swing.
Very honored. Thank you. Thank you. Very honored. Thank you.
Charles Aniagolu.
Very honored to meet you. At times over the last year, the new leadership appeared to be limping. It looked almost as if it might be overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the problems left behind by previous governments. In the event, it limped through various challenges, but it didn't break. I'm Charles Aniagolu in Abuja. This has been an Arise News special report.